Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We're continuing Central and East Africa. We last explored Rwanda, and now we explore the history and current affairs of Burundi, which neighbors Congo, is just below Rwanda, and it neighbors Uganda. And we are joined once again. It's our returning champion, the brilliant historian and journalist and activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, and also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, who will be our guide on this trip to Burundi's history and current affairs. So, Abayomi, once again, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much for the continued invitations.
Always an honor, and always an honor to have you on. And as always, folks, please donate generously, not just to One Plus One, but do donate generously to Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. And please donate generously if you can to One Plus One. Share all of our content, past and present, and help us overcome the far right algorithms. Help us overcome the monopoly Western corporate media and state media has in social media. So again, please do share widely One Plus One's content, and again, donate to us. And now on to the topic at hand, Burundi. My first question, Abayomi, is talk to us about what was Burundi like before both German and Belgian colonialism, and then my follow-up question to that is what was Burundi like when it was the same country as Rwanda, known as Rwanda-Urundi, and when it was and when it was under German colonialism, and how did it become a Belgian colony?
Thank you once again. And around the 16th century, you had the formation of monarchies, similar to what happened in Rwanda. In Burundi, there was the Kingdom of Burundi that existed, and there was a ruling monarch. And also there was a class of aristocrats which existed there. But the divisions, the ethnic divisions, a lot of it had to do with social class designations, even under the pre-colonial period. For example, the majority of the ethnic groups, the people who were the Hutu were the majority of the population. The Tutsi were the minority, yet the Tutsi population were herders, and the Hutu population were mainly people who dealt with agricultural production. So during this period, there was a class division between the ethnic groups that were based upon the economic positioning within society. Now, when the Germans came in initially, beginning in the late 1800s, we talked about earlier, the German East Africa Company. Well, they did some of the same atrocities that were committed in Tanganyika, as well as Rwanda. And today we're talking about Burundi or Urundi. And the country was ruled as one, Rwanda and Urundi. And they were under German domination from approximately the 1880s all the way up until the late 1950s, when there was a transition announced, and then the independence of the country in 1962. But when they got independence, they were still under monarchical rule, which is quite interesting. They didn't become a republic until 1966. However, during this period, though, there was much consternation, conflict going on. A lot of this had been institutionalized by German and later Belgian colonialism, elevating the Tutsi population to positions in the bureaucracy as people involved in the security apparatus of the country. And at the same time, the Hutu population, which were the majority, were considered of a lower class as being subservient to the Tutsi population, who collaborated heavily with the German and later the Belgian colonialists. Now, these are just general categorizations. You have people on both sides, who are anti-colonial, who wanted to bring about greater unity among the two major ethnic groups. But unfortunately, as time went on, as the decades progressed, these contradictions became violent and even genocidal. And we'll probably talk about that earlier. There was also a small population of the Twa people, who in the West are categorized as pygmies. They also inhabit sections of Burundi as well. So we have the rise of the kingdoms in both Rwanda and Burundi, and the social status, which had some ethnic overtones, and then the intervention of the Germans, which of course institutionalized these ethnic divisions and weaponized them, which later led to greater divisions, civil war, and genocidal onslaughts.
Interesting. And what was Burundi like under Belgian colonialism? And did Burundi experience a lot of the brutality of horrific human rights abuses like Congo? And if the answer is no, then do tell us what distinguished and made Belgian rule over Burundi distinct from Congo, because Burundi and Rwanda were, were one country. So I'm curious I'm curious what was the uh, unique, evil colonial experience Rwanda-Urundi had compared to Congo.
Well, of course, under Germany, initially, there was the similar repression. There was the so-called Ashaburi revolt of the early 1890s, which were put down by the Germans. Karl Peters, who was a German colonial officer, a co-founder of the German East Africa Company. These are some of the same characters who were involved in Tanganyika, who were involved in Rwanda. So they were very brutal, they were very exploitative, and got to the point where rule was actually turned over to what was called German East Africa, which was a colony set up by Berlin, perhaps 15 years after the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, some 140 years ago. But Burundi did not have the metals and the minerals for extraction that what we saw in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that distinguishes it in many ways. At the same time, they were heavily involved in agricultural production. But the same restrictive rule was imposed on Burundi as was in Rwanda and the DRC and Tanganyika. In Burundi, since they had a monarchy, there was a form of indirect rule as well, where they had people within the monarchy in the kingdom of Burundi. Some were collaborators with the Germans as well as the Belgian colonial forces. Now, this started to be shaken up during the period of World War II, when Belgium was made an official United Nations trusteeship territory. Prior to that, the League of Nations had made Belgium the official trustee over Burundi. This was after the takeover of the area by Belgium from the German colonialists. During World War I, there was a huge battle that took place in East Africa between the Belgians, the British against the Germans. The Belgians and the British won out, and they, of course, divided up the spoils among themselves. So this went on up until I mentioned World War I. After World War I, it was the League of Nations that set up the trusteeship. Then, of course, World War II and another defeat of Germany, although they tried to retake some of their colonies, particularly in North Africa, intervening in North Africa after the Italians were defeated. But at the same time, what happened was that in 1959, there was a lot of agitation for independence, which was understandable. You had independence movements that were developing all across Africa, particularly in the post-World War II period. And in 1959, there was a transitional process which took place. Nonetheless, there was a huge conflict that developed in 1959, where the Hutu majority population attempted to overthrow the monarchy that was dominant in Burundi. And it led to the
Okay,
deaths of
interesting.
many, many people, so-called Hutu revolution. And then, of course, after that, the ascendancy of the first independence government in 1962 was complicated as well. You had the forces of the monarchy, but they were split. Some wanted to move away from the monarchical rule and develop political parties that were not based on ethnic divisions, but would bring together the Hutu and the Tutsi populations. Uh, there was a party called the Front UPRONA, the Front for National Liberation, which was a dominant political party for many years inside the country. Yet, some of the leadership were compromised, others were assassinated, and that took place during the early 1960s. People, for example, Louis Wangari, who was a leader of UPRONA, one of the independence movements there, he
Yeah.
was overthrown and assassinated uh, by people who were against his policies. So by 1962, the country had gained its independence, but still under a monarchical control. It wasn't until 1966 that the monarchy was eventually overthrown and the Republic of Burundi was established in 1966. So that's a brief update on developments that happened. Michelle Mikombero
Yeah.
became president of the country in 1966, and reforms were instituted. However, problems were not fully resolved, and they resurfaced in 1972, and of course, several coups d'états, uh, problems associated with ethnic divisions still continue to plague the country after independence, well into the 1990s.
Fascinating. Well, you already, I think you've already answered, my question, which was talk to us about the relations the Belgians fostered between Hutus and Tutsis in Burundi and how it was different from Rwanda. You can answer that question if you want, but I think you already sort of answered that. You already sort of answered how did independence come to Burundi and what was, but actually, well, talk to us then about Burundi's place during the Cold War, and talk to us about the legacy of the first three Burundian presidents. So that's Michel, Mikobero, Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, and Pierre Boyoya. All of them Tutsis of the Union for National Progress, which was, according to Wikipedia, its ideology was Burundian nationalism. However, Tutsi interests and well, yes, and take it away from there. I'm curious your response.
Yeah, the military was heavily dominated by the Tutsi population, and that gave them an edge as opposed to neighboring Rwanda, where it was just the opposite in terms of Hutu dominated military, at least up to the time period that the Rwandan Patriotic Front took over. Uh, they attempted to maintain a neutral position during the Cold War, although during a period, middle period there, they developed good relations with the People's Republic of China. But they have tried
Interesting.
they have tried over the years to maintain a neutral position in regard to Cold War politics, but it's always very, very difficult. Now, with, of course, China playing a major role in terms of economic cooperation with Africa, they have outstripped the United States in terms of uh, actual investments as well as trade. But at the same time, it has not necessarily positively impacted the governments particularly in Rwanda and in Burundi. But in Burundi, in particular, they tried to maintain a neutral position during the course of the Cold War, which we could say extends from 1946, 1947 up to perhaps 1989, at most 1991, with the total collapse of the Soviet Union.
And actually, it's quite fascinating. And I would say Sadly, unfortunately, when we talked about Kenya, I said to you when I was doing my research about Kenya how shocked I was actually how right wing the leadership of of Kenya has often been, including to today. And I guess you can say that's the same thing in Burundi, like its neighbor Rwanda, like Uganda. If we talk about Idi Amin and later Youri Museveni. And if we talk about Congo under Mobutu, Burundi is a very, very right wing country. So, and Wikipedia, when it was explaining the union for national progress and the first three leaderships,
Uprona, yes.
it says here under Pierre Buyoya, economic liberalization. So that's black capitalism. Under Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, mixed economy, but more in favor of capitalism. He was supportive of anti-ethnicism, so he did believe in some kind of united Burundi nationality and so forth. However, he promoted pro small scale capitalist agriculture and more or less kept the German model of colonialism, except with black characteristics, so black capitalism for you. And then, interesting enough, under it says here in Wikipedia, under Michel Micobero, he believed in democratic centralism, but he strongly also contradictorily believed in Mobutuism and so forth. and then under uh, and then under Louis Ragaswar, I hope I'm saying it right. While he was anti-colonial and so forth, believed in constitutional monarchies and so forth.
Hmm.
So Burundi's a
Yeah.
very very right wing. So Burundi's a very very right wing country. Your yeah your response to that before I get to my next question.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the period with Louis Wagori during the early independence period. They struggled as on behalf of the monarchy, and they wanted to divide, make sure that there was a rupturing between Rwanda and Burundi. But like I said, even though they advocated multi-ethnic approach to governing and a popular political party, they still did it within the context of a monarchy, somewhat of a constitutional monarchical arrangement. And that went on for a number of years. And then, of course, in 1966, after developments in 1965, they were able to overthrow the monarchy and become a republic. But as you mentioned, it's not been any type of staunch anti-imperialist or revolutionary orientation of the governments that have evolved since 1962.
And talk to us then about the legacy of Mouchouar Nadaya. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, whose background was a banker and he was a Hutu, and he was the first Burundian of a Hutu background who was democratically elected. And he came from the political party Front for Democracy in Burundi, which, although appealed to the Hutu community, was apparently quite left leaning, at least on paper, and they
Mhm.
are supposed to be advocates of democratic socialism or social democracy. They are members, consultative members of Socialist International, and while Socialist International is dominated by Western European and North American social democratic parties who are actually very right leaning. I'm curious. I'm curious. Talk to us about the legacy of Michelle Nzaya.
Yeah, I think that was a period in which they attempted to break with some aspects of the colonial and neo-colonial legacy. However, uh, dealing with the ethnic divisions inside the country, the constant conflict, periodic conflict between the military and the civilian population, elements within the military that were divided along ethnic lines, it hampered their movement towards progress. But yes, to have a president elected from the Hutu group was significant in that particular regard. And there were efforts made to try to build unity throughout the country. Unfortunately, though, civil war continued to erupt throughout the country. We mentioned 1972, and then, of course, later in 1993, when there was a attempted coup and the killing of many thousands of people that took place in Burundi between 1993 up until about 2005.
So after Milshwar came to power, so after Milshwar came, uh, uh, so after his time in office, the return to power of Rona came and talked to us about the terms in office and legacies of Francois Negezi. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. Sylvie Keneg. This is a woman leader. Both of the Hutu backgrounds. Talk to us about them before we talk about presidency. Peren.
Now, you're talking about Pierre Nkurunziza. Uh,
Yes.
They came to power in 2005.
Oh,
Yeah,
no. I'm
no,
talking
before
about
that.
I'm talking about Francois Negezi, and Sylvie Keneg, who were both apparently they're from the Uprona party, but both and both Hutus.
Yeah, well, the Brona Party, as I mentioned before, has attempted from the earlier phase of the National Liberation Movement to form a multi-ethnic party. And that has been their objective periodically, but there's been problems with that, considering the fact that the military has been at some points at odds with the political leadership of the country. So what needs to happen in such an incident is some type of outside intervention, which did take place from the Organization of African Unity and even individual African states during the 1970s when you had another outbreak of ethnic violence, and also later during the 1990s. However, the contradictions were so great during that particular time period. We're talking about the late 1950s all the way up to the 1970s, extended into the 1990s. So yes, it's a serious problem. All of the leaders of Burundi have had to deal with this issue, and only recently there's been some progress in that regard over the last 20 years in terms of building some type of multi-ethnic or multi-party political system in Burundi.
That's fascinating, and that's a perfect segue then to talking about the legacy of this particular leader. So, talk to us about this leader. Talk to us about Cyprien Ntaryamira. Apologies if I'm butchering his name. He was a Hutu again, but he was from the Front for Democracy in Burundi, who was murdered along with Hutu Rwandan right-leaning dictator Jovenel Habyarimana, who many now accuse with credible evidence that it was the Western Ugandan-backed Paul Kagame of the Tutsi ethno-nationalist Rwandan Patriotic Front that sparked the bloodshed of what is now known as the Rwandan genocide. I actually prefer to call it the Rwandan Civil War because it was an extension of a more bloodier chapter in the Civil War that saw a huge change in the balance of power and Western imperial order in Central and East Africa. And while Jovenel was certainly of the far right, Cyprien, very interesting enough when reading about him, he was an imperfect politician, an imperfect man, but he was still of the left of the political spectrum. So, yes, talk to us about his legacy before he was murdered, and allegedly by Paul Kagame, but that's a whole nother. We've already talked about Rwanda enough, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. But
yeah, Cyprien Ntaryamira went down with Habyarimana on that fateful plane downing in early April of 1994. He wanted peace in neighboring Rwanda. It would have had an impact on Burundi as well. There was already conflict that was raging inside of Burundi as early as 1993.
Yeah.
And so he viewed a peace settlement in Rwanda as being helpful, possibly potentially helpful to the situation in neighboring Burundi. Unfortunately, he went down. And after that, the war continued in Burundi, and the genocide erupted fully in Rwanda. So in that regard, his legacy was clearly something that brought about the further ethnic divisions of both Burundi and Rwanda, despite his politics being more to the left than Habyarimana in neighboring Rwanda. And that entire period in Rwanda and Burundi was very tragic in 1994, but Burundi went on even further. After 1994, 1995, as the war still raged, they attempted under the government of the next president of Burundi that took over after the downing of the plane, they attempted to mediate the conflict that was going on inside the country. At one point, they even had the newly elected president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, involved in an attempted negotiation, which did not work. However, eventually it did end with some type of an agreement by 2005, and that was under Pierre Nkurunziza. But yes, it's an ongoing problem in Burundi. Burundi is quite interesting that their economy is largely based on agricultural production and export, and it's distinguished itself in that regard from the DRC and even Tanzania at this point. Tanzania, of course, has many important strategic minerals. The DRC as well. Rwanda less so. So it depends upon the level of economic dependency that these countries have on the West, and also the level of the West's interests in the economic resources of those countries. That largely determines, in many cases, how much media coverage they get in the West and how much attention they get from successive U.S. administrations.
And after the murder of after the murder of
Cyprian.
after the murder of Cyprien, another Hutu took power, and that was Silvestre Ntibantunganya. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. Apologies if I am butchering his name. How do you assess his how do you assess his time in office? And after how do you assess his time in office? And then we'll talk about Pierre Buyoya.
Yeah, it was a similar situation, instability, conflict with even neighboring Rwanda after the RPF took over. There were accusations that the Hutu nationalists were utilizing Burundi as a staging ground of leveling attacks against Rwanda. So yes, it was a serious problem. The Interahamwe, which was the militia group that was heavily involved in the genocide in Rwanda during 1994. They, of course, continued to organize in the Eastern DRC as well as in Burundi. So there's a lot of tension between Rwanda and the DRC, as well as Rwanda and Burundi as well during that particular time period.
And after him, we saw the return of Pierre Buyoya, who a long time ago had previously held a position of power in Burundi, and he returned to power. He actually died in the year 2020, and the Tutsi nationalist right-leaning UPRONA returned. How was he as a leader of Burundi?
Well, he did work towards implementing the peace agreement between the various factions in Burundi. So he was positive in that particular regard. He maintained power for approximately 15 years. There was unrest when he attempted to extend his term of office in Burundi. Demonstrations surrounded that. But he was able to maintain his authority up until 2020 when he died suddenly. Now, the official cause of death was a heart attack, but some people have speculated he had died from COVID-19. It never was really clear. A lot of people were dying from that disease. In fact, the president of Tanzania died during that time period as well. They said it was of natural causes. Nonetheless, a lot of people speculated it was COVID-19. But we still have not found out the actual cause of death. But this occurred in 2020. So, yes, he was positive in the sense that he was able to negotiate and oversee a peace agreement that calmed some of the tensions between the military and the civilian apparatus of the country.
Fascinating. And after a tumultuous period, the bloody 90s, we enter the 2000s, and the Hutus get into power again under Domitien Nadayizi. I hope I'm saying, apologies again, folks, if I'm butchering all these names. And the Front for Democracy in Burundi returns to office. What is his legacy?
Yeah, well, positive as well as negative. Positive from the standpoint of attempting to resolve the internal conflicts inside the country, still not fully breaking with the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism inside the country. And that's very difficult because it's an agriculturally, economically based country. And as a result of that, it's heavily dependent upon the prices set by the imperialist countries for products being produced and exported from the country.
Yes, and it's 2005, and an outsider gets into power. Actually, wait, am I correct? Yes. So it's
Pierre Nkurunziza, yeah, in
so
2005
exactly.
to
It's
20. He
2000
served for 15 years,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So 2005, an outsider gets into power again. Pierre uh, Nkurunziza of the National Council for the Defense of Democracy, Forces for the Defense of Democracy. And again, while they appeal to Hutu nationalism, they believe, at least on paper, in true left-leaning populism, anti-capitalism, anti-neocolonialism, and his leadership provide so how do you assess his leadership? Does it provide a much needed positive change in legacy, or is it sadly business as usual in terms of sectarianism, divisions, but still more stable compared to other African countries? I'm curious.
Yeah, it appeared to calm down the internal conflict inside the country. There was a peace agreement, and his legacy is enforcing that peace agreement, even though a lot of people inside the country feel he overstayed his term of office by seeking a third term. Nonetheless, it was a lot better than what had existed during the period between 1993 and 2005, that 12-year period of civil war and unrest that took place inside the country. So, in that regard, it was very progressive from the standpoint that was able to implement a peace agreement inside the country and get some semblance of a national unity government that was functioning.
And he is succeeded by a member of his party, and that person is Evarista Nandiasha Imie. I hope again, apologies if I'm butchering all of these names. I will practice my African pronunciations of all these names. But yes, and he takes office in 2020. How do you assess his governance, President Evariste?
Well, he's been able to maintain peace inside the country. There has not been a recrudescence of ethnic conflict. There's not been a military coup inside the country since he took power. So yes, in that regard, I would think it's quite positive. Although African countries today are facing greater challenges in regard to the imposition of tariffs by the Trump administration. Also, has been the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, or the Russian special military operations in Ukraine, which has disrupted supply chains, disrupted agricultural exports from Russia and Ukraine to various African countries. That's why the African Union was very much concerned about resolving the Russian-Ukraine war through diplomatic means. That has still not happened as of yet. And a lot of these countries are suffering due to lack of agricultural imports, not only actual food, but also agricultural inputs, such as tractors and fertilizer and other agricultural inputs that are needed for agricultural production. And Burundi is heavily an agricultural based economy.
And from there, this is actually my final question. And from there, talk more about what are the current state of Burundi, its relations with Rwanda and Uganda, BRICS, its stance on Rwanda's endless aggression and slaughter in Congo DRC, and what do you think needs to happen for peace between the two tribes in Burundi to end its sectarianism and for Pan-Africanism, leftism to flourish in Burundi? Although, from the research I've done on Burundi and from what you've talked about with the last three presidents, it sounds as if Burundi, kind of like Tanzania, is more or less on that way of a pan-Africanist leftism, however imperfect, but they are trying to build it despite Western imperialism still being super aggressive, despite them officially being, a non-aligned member and being neutral, wanting China to help them out with the U.S. sabotaging, despite a very so I'm curious. Talk to us about Burundi and current state of affairs and them going.
Yeah, I think the BRICS Plus Summit has provided inspiration and hope to most countries on the African continent. It's still not clear how they're going to plug into the entire process. It would definitely help Burundi as an agricultural producing country if they could get credits from alternative sources like the New Development Bank, which is a manifestation of the BRICS Plus Summit. The New Development Bank, headed by Dilma Rousseff, the former president of the Republic of Brazil, is attempting to set up an alternative institution to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But it's going to be a struggle. And in regard to its relationship with Rwanda, there have been accusations by Rwanda of them housing Hutu rebel groups inside the country, which they have denied. In terms of its relationship to China, it appears to be very good in terms of diplomatic relations, as well as some joint economic programs between Burundi, the other African Union states, and the People's Republic of China. But all of these countries, until you can have the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was agreed upon several years ago, which has its headquarters in Ghana. But at the same time, the countries are going to have to, at least to a large degree, de-link from the former colonial powers and the United States in order for that to actually be effective. In terms of inter-African trade, collaborative industrial, communication, and transportation projects. All of this is called for not only through the African Union Charter, the so-called CERT Declaration of 1999, which was the basis for the formation or the reconfiguration of the OAU into the African Union in 2002. But then the African Continental Free Trade Area is a continuation of that process. But it's not going to be able to happen unless the African countries can break their dependency on the Western imperialist states. You still have problems in regard to loans, indebtedness, which is rising again. Countries like Zambia, for example, Egypt, and others are suffering as a result of international debt servicing and debt obligations. Ghana has had to once again bow down to another IMF conditionalities loan. Same situation with Egypt as well. So until that can be overcome, it's going to be very limited in regard to what the African countries can achieve in relationship to full economic, military, security, cultural, and political integration, which is the ultimate objective. You have at present an estimated 1.4 billion people on the African continent. Africa has all types of minerals, metals, energy resources, agricultural resources, potential for hydroelectric power, yet the divisions, the ongoing legacy of neocolonialism is going to hamper the capacity for a real takeoff, a genuine economic reconstruction of the African continent. And that's what people out here are advocating for. That's what the patriots inside the continent are advocating for. And that's what needs to take place. These internal divisions, even border divisions, continue to hamper the capacity of Africa to unite. We've seen recently border conflicts between Guinea-Conakry and Sierra Leone, something that stems directly from the legacy of French and British imperialism. The divisions in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are a direct result of the legacies of German as well as Belgian colonialism, the collaboration of the British, the role of the United States. So we have to overcome all of that to realize that Africa is one continent, that the interest of African people lies in their unity, and that there cannot be any genuine development without unity and without a delinking from the world imperialist system.
I wasn't planning on asking this question, but let me ask it anyways. When researching Burundi, your outlet, Black Agenda Report, had a reprinted news from DW, Deutsche Welle, which is a German state subsidized, state funded outlet, and apparently Burundi was asking or demanding that Germany pay compensation for its colonial legacy. Haiti still demands, regardless of whether there's a right-wing leadership or a Western puppet in power, but Haiti still demands that France give compensation to Haiti for the odious debts they inflicted on Haiti, because Haiti had to pay France for the loss of use, of France, having the country, as not just, a colony, but basically like one giant slave country and so forth. Do you think, and Belgium has never ever, given any sort of, reparations to the Holocaust they inflicted on Congo, as well as the intergenerational trauma and still sectarianism that we see in both Rwanda and Burundi, which Belgium themselves is still part of. They still play a reactionary force. So, do you think that Burundi should still be persistent in demanding Germany and even Belgium, and I think you can even arguably say all of the Western countries, that they should be the ones demand that they should be paying reparations to Burundi for its many problems, not least extreme poverty and the inability to unite the country because of colonialism polluting people's minds with sectarianism and so forth.
They surely owe reparations to the African states. The question is how much and under what terms. How could they repay Africa for the damage that's already been done? For example, the German colonialists, the German East Africa Company inflicted horrendous brutality and the exploitation of African labor from the late 19th century all the way to the beginning of the early 20th century, when German East Africa was established. Karl Peters, who we've talked about before, an explorer, he was one of the co-founders of the German East Africa Company, was even, in fact, withdrawn from his role by the German government because of the brutality that he inflicted under his authority to the African people there. Same situation with Belgium. We know what happened there in terms of the brutal labor policies and land seizures that took place. And all of them, whether you talk about France in terms of their exploitation of Haiti, Mali, all these other countries in West Africa, they owe an incalculable amount of money to their African people. In Namibia, for example, there was some negotiations between the traditional leadership of the Herero and the Nama several years ago, and some agreement was reached, but it was outside the control of the Republic of Namibian government. So there has to be a formula for the repayment of reparations. In Namibia, they slaughtered 60 to 80% of the population during the early part of the 20th century. In Tanganyika, during the same time period, they repressed the Maji revolt, which killed and imprisoned many, many people. We saw what happened in Kenya during the 1950s with the so-called Mama Rebellion and its suppression. During the 1890s, for example, the crushing of the Asubiri revolt, which was a revolt on the part of various ethnic groups and nationalities in East Africa against Germany. And so all of these incidents which have occurred require a real negotiation, but it will require an admission on the part of the colonial powers as it relates to the crimes they committed. Now, in Belgium, even though the successors of the monarchy did go to the Democratic Republic of Congo in recent years, and they did somewhat apologize for the atrocities committed, and they returned a tooth that was being held as a souvenir of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister inside the country. They still have not owned up, to the hell on earth that they created in Congo from the 1870s all the way up at least until 1960 and even beyond. We could clearly say that the problems there since 1960 over the last 65 years are a direct result of the inability of Belgium and other countries, including the United States, to recorrect the problems that developed during the colonial era. So yes, they all owe reparations, but they do not want to admit that they're guilty because it opens up the floodgates. Same thing here in the United States. That's why no U.S. government, even under Barack Obama, who ran as a self-identified African-American, refused to apologize for the enslavement of African people inside the United States for 250 years, and then the post-Civil War period of at least 100 years of legalized segregation, lynching, disproportionate incarceration, and so forth, and then another 60 years of unfulfilled promises, let's say between 1964 up until today, where you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, you had affirmative action, which has now been outlawed. But all of that has not fully recorrected the oppression and class exploitation that African Americans are facing in the United States. In fact, now it's going even further backwards under Trump because they've outlawed diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're trying to erase African American history in general. They're trying to, you see what is happening at the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum.
Yeah, it's outrageous.
It's being criticized. People are claiming artifacts have been removed. I don't know if that's exactly true. The director has resigned. So all of these things are going on, even in terms of military involvement of African Americans. Every war, every major war that's been fought, Black people in the United States have been involved in it through drafting or other methods. And they've even taken down pages which reveal the military history of African Americans, even within the U.S. imperialist armies. Somehow they view that as being a threat to the current status of the MAGA Republican regime that is now in power
And
inside the
apparently,
United States.
and apparently, if we talk about the plight of indigenous Americans, indigenous
Even
Hawaiians,
more so.
indigenous Alaskans, apparently, uh, it's it was only under Joe Biden sometime last year who actually apologized to survivors and descendants of the residential school programs. Uh, and apparently, like, no United States president has ever formally got got both Democrats and Republicans together, both bodies of Congress, to even apologize for the dispossession of Native Americans, the theft of Native Americans, the genocide of entire communities, the ongoing brutal subjugation of indigenous Americans in certain reserves, because not all reserves are depressing slums and so forth. But still, there never has been, a formal apology from the United States government, just sort of off the cuff or when under pressure on certain days, whether it's Thanksgiving Day or Columbus Day, has a governor or even the president sort of off the cuff, sort of like, we apologize for past atrocities and so forth. And it's just it's mind baffling given that like you guys are literally the reasons why this community faces these problems, why that community faces this problem, why this country is facing this problem. It goes back to what Walter Rodney said. His famous book is about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, or as Michael
Exactly.
Parenti said, Africa is rich. It's just its people are poor, and
Yes.
that's not by design. That is because of Western imperialism and so forth. So,
Exactly.
your response to that before we close?
Well, for example, in Kenya, now the British government about a decade or so ago agreed to some type of compensation program for victims of those literal concentration camps that were set up during the 1950s in response to the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion, the rebellion of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army. Yet, many people say they were not compensated and they felt the compensation was inadequate. So that situation still remains unresolved. And those camps were set up over a period of years, and they weren't closed until approximately 1960, when it was revealed of a mass poisoning that took place inside those camps in Kenya, and that was even suppressed. The information did leak out, and as a result of that, there was some movement towards some transitional process towards independence, which took place in 1963. So the same situation with Burundi, the legacy of German colonialism, Belgian colonialism, the interference even by France, because French is one of the official languages of Burundi, along with Kiswahili. These issues are very, very important to be resolved, because the continent is not going to move forward without the resolution of these issues. And we still see today the interference of the West into events taking place in East Africa and Central Africa. Just recently, the signing of this purported peace accord between the foreign ministries of Rwanda and the DRC, mediated ostensibly by the U.S. State Department. My belief is that it's not going to result in peace. It's just going to result in more confusion and the ongoing exploitation of the critical minerals in the Eastern DRC, even conceding territory to Rwanda and its M23 proxies. There's no guarantee this is going to bring peace to Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. We hope that the people will resolve the issues involving Rwanda and the DRC among themselves without the intervention of the United States, because we know historically what has happened. 60 years ago, we know that they were involved in bombing areas in Eastern DRC under the Johnson administration. There were attempts to revive the Lumumba's movement, Che Guevara's intervention and so forth, which failed at the time. But it's an ongoing struggle. You're talking about the last 65 years of efforts to build a genuinely united and democratic and liberated DRC. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's the same situation in Rwanda and Burundi. All three of these countries, all three of them, were victims of Belgian colonialism and U.S. Neocolonialism. So that has to be addressed, and any peace negotiations and any peace agreement between Rwanda and the DRC.
Oh, and I'll leave people with a very, very interesting fun fact. Now I know there's going to be. I know it's another one of those remembrance periods about
Yes,
World War II and so forth, and of course, because Russia and China are the root of all evil of today, they're not going to be acknowledged for Chinese resistance of Mao Zedong is not going to be acknowledged for helping liberate not just China but much of Asia against Japanese fascism.
right,
Russia's contributions are not going to be acknowledged, even though Russia was vital, and I mean vital, to the liberation of Eastern Europe and actually all of Europe. But here's a fun fact. So I don't agree with everything that China does in Africa, and probably don't. And I think you can even make some criticism about Putin when they have good relations with Rwanda, good relations with certain African countries that they shouldn't have good relations with. But here is a very, very, very fun fact. During the Cold War, the USSR and China, although they were bad on South Africa, all more or less supported liberation movements, supported the sovereignty of all African countries, never got into any sort of predatory loans with any of those countries. And even though both China and Russia could have easily supported some communist movement, the most far left movements, they always supported, okay, ANC first and then South African Communist Party or any type of Communist Party. So I just think it's a very interesting fun fact that Russia and China have always respected African sovereignty, and even now to this day, both Russia and China do more or less respect African sovereignty, almost to a default. And yet, it's the West, which claims that Africans don't trust China, Africans don't trust Russia, and what are these Africans doing butting up to these dictatorships when us, the West, have been nothing but anywho. So
yeah, it's ridiculous, and you see with the VE Day commemorations in Moscow that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, was present along with other heads of state, even from Africa. So yeah, it shows that Russia is not nearly as isolated as the U.S. would portray. And I think this is very, very important for people to look at and understand that the world is much bigger than the U.S. And also other developments that have been taking place is that there has been closer relations between the Alliance of Sahel states and the Russian Federation, along with China as well. So even though Michael Langley, who is the commander of the U.S. AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command, who attacked Ibrahim Traore before the U.S. Senate last month, this prompted solidarity worldwide with the Burkinabe revolution at this stage. And on April 30th, there were demonstrations not only in Burkina Faso and the other AES states, but all across the world in solidarity with the people of Burkina Faso against U.S. and French imperialism. There were even some demonstrations here in the United States in solidarity with Burkina Faso. So all of these things are going on. And despite the fact they're trying to alienate these progressive forces in Africa, it is prompting greater internationalism and greater forms of Pan-Africanism.
yeah, and fun fact: Russia and China only have one foreign base, and that's in Djibouti, whereas America, Britain, France, Belgium, NATO. So again, your Nordic countries, your Swiss, your Swiss countries, your Luxembourg countries, are not innocent actors. They're actually complicit in the ongoing scramble for Africa. So,
Yeah, but what's interesting is
I
that
leave people with that fun fact.
but what's really interesting is that this phase of US imperialism under Trump, he's even pressuring the NATO allies, like Britain, for example, to pay more money for their national defense. And supposedly they have a trade agreement with the U.S. It has to be seen what actually comes out of it. But even the European Union, all of these countries are being pressured by the United States, Canada. Mark Carney, the new prime minister, was here earlier this week. He said Canada is not for sale. Trump said the borders are artificial. We don't need Canadian automobiles, so on and so forth. So it's pretty absurd, the level of diplomacy, even among the imperialist countries themselves, under this period of MAGA republicanism in the United States.
Yes, and let that also be a warning to the right wing, far rights of Africa that
Yes,
you can be as slavish as you want to
exactly.
Canadian, British, U.S. multinational businesses. You can even allow their army to you can even allow their army to train you to keep the working class in line. One of these days, it's just a matter of time they will betray you. So
Yeah, exactly. Look what happened in the Sahel states. All of these military leaders that took power had very close ties with the U.S. and France through AFRICOM and the French Foreign Legions. Whether it's Simi Gueta in Mali, whether it's the military in Burkina Faso and Niger. They were being trained by the U.S. and France, but at the same time, at some point, they realized, it was absurd what they were doing. That the same people that were training them were actually also training and arming the rebels that they were fighting against. So this shows the vicious game that's being played. So hopefully the others will reach the same conclusion and move towards the continental army that is so much needed to resolve these internal conflicts throughout the continent.
exactly, couldn't agree more. Well, it's a perfect place to end. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with Abayomi Azikiwe, journalist and historian of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports, which is news commentary and analysis from a Black left perspective. Donate generously to both those outlets as well as One Plus One. And again, folks, share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present. Donate to us and join us next week in our journey across the African continent, where we'll be exploring Congo, but no, not Belgian Congo, DRC, Zaire, French Congo. So I'm looking
Congo Brazzaville.
so exactly Congo Brazzaville. So looking forward to that. And until then, all my best folks, good night and good luck, and have a great and have a great weekend.